I would say that one of the dirty secrets of artificial intelligence is that almost every machine learning system is biased. One of the reasons why I have been very outspoken in terms of saying that biases are okay really come down to two aspects of what those biases mean. When I'm building a system about conflict, for example, and we're making it so that an actor has an in-group, out-group bias, right? So it will do positive things to its in-group, but it might do something negative towards someone who's outside of their group. That's very human. That's exactly what we're seeing on the ground.
Unicorn Buzz. Nový podcast Forbes Slovensko o startupoch a inováciách.
So Simonou Gulisovou.
What if AI could predict the war before it starts? My guest today built a technology that simulates entire societies, and the UN called him when they ran out of ideas on how to solve one of the most impossible conflicts. He's an Oxford scientist running a startup in Bratislavy. This is Justin Lane, co-founder of CulturePulse. Justin, welcome to Unicorn Buzz.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, we have a lot to talk about.
Yes.
So let's start with the basic one.
Mm-hmm.
You are an Oxford-trained scientist living in Bratislava who got stopped at a gunpoint while doing a research for United Nations in the West Bank. How does someone end up on this trajectory?
Well, the story kind of begins, if I should give you the long story,
Sure.
From the beginning. Yeah. Well, I knew from a very young age that I wanted to study psychology and culture and extremism in particular, and what makes people do some of the craziest things that you can imagine. And I was still relatively young when September 11th happened, and that was something that impacted me a lot, my family a lot personally, being from the area. And so I just got really enthralled by this question. I got really taken by this question of what makes people do some of the most irrational things you can think of. What motivates them to do these things? And that kind of set me on a path to figure out, well, how can I study this? How can I better understand this? And led me to ultimately realize that psychology was the way to do that. And as I kept getting deeper into psychology, I started looking into this particular aspect of psychology that intersects with artificial intelligence and computer modeling. And from there, it just hit me that if you could create a computer model of what's going on in people's brains as they might be doing something like fighting or killing or going into some extremist movement, that could be a really, really powerful tool to try and help to come up with solutions to these really hard issues. And so I left the US in 2010 and moved to Belfast in Northern Ireland, because if you want to study religious extremism, Belfast is an interesting place to go. It was just a few years out from its Good Friday Agreement, about a decade out from the peace agreement there. And so there was still a lot of tension. There still is a lot of tension in Belfast. But that was really what kind of set me down the path. And I immediately thought, okay, the only other place where I could really go and do this and study this and try and bring this idea to the world and really see if it works would be to go and do then my doctorate degree at Oxford, which I then did on the use of AI for modeling large-scale religious groups. And that just kind of led to more and more research. I met the co-founder at CulturePulse. He was reading this, and then we started working together at Boston University on things like extremism, refugee resettlement, migration, a lot of these really, really touchy issues that need good scientifically backed solutions. And after a while, we just realized, there's a company behind this that we could start. It's not just about research. We could probably do this bigger, faster, and better if we started a company for it. And so that's kind of what led me down the path.
Yeah, but what was the turning point when you combined your research and your studies with the technology? Because it's like two different things. When we say technology, everybody is thinking about some gadgets and maybe softwares, not of the philosophical kind of way.
Yeah, a lot of people don't think about the software that goes behind technology. But for me, it's all about the software. Other people will build hardware much better than I have the ability to do that. So you just kind of try and do what you're good at. For me, I think the first time that I started to realize we're really onto something would have been around it would have been after 2015 where we were building a computer model of conflict in Northern Ireland. And we had built a model that's not just a model of the conflict, but also a model of the peace process, because there were a lot of models of conflict. There still are a lot of models of conflict. And there are some models of peace, but there weren't any models that were really looking at conflict and peace at the same time. And that, once we were able to crack that using this specific technique and software that we were designing, that became a moment where we thought, okay, we've done something no one else has done, and it works really, really well. We were able to get it to reproduce the conflict in Northern Ireland with 98% accuracy. We then took the same model and looked at a place called Gujarat, India, which had almost the same number of deaths, but in a period of we're not talking decades like Northern Ireland, we're talking days in Gujarat. And we were able to simulate the same dynamics there. And that's when we realized that it wasn't just about the conflict that we had modeled something interesting. We had modeled something interesting about how humans think and how humans operate, and something about human nature that allows us to do good things like band together, but also do really bad things like fight other people who have banded together, right? And you get that in-group, out-group kind of us and them dynamic, and being able to simulate those aspects. That was when we thought, oh, it doesn't just work in one place for one thing. It can work in multiple places, and maybe even for multiple things. And so that, I think, was probably the first time I thought, whoa, this is pretty cool.
And what year are we talking about when you were doing these projects?
So that paper came out. It was published in a journal in 2017, and we got some interesting coverage by a lot of the global media around that time for it. It was the first time that anybody outside of the research community really cared about what we were doing. But I started building the framework for that model. It would have been 2010, 2011.
Yeah, I'm asking because like 10 years ago, the AI wasn't as developed as today. So how did it work?
Some parts of AI, yeah. Yeah, so, and this is something I think is really interesting for a lot of people, is that when they think about AI, today everyone who thinks about AI, they think about large language models in particular. They might know that behind a large language model is a massive artificial neural network that's trying to simulate part of your brain. Most AI, the vast majority of AI, are those kinds of networks where you put a bunch of data in, it learns how the data goes together in different patterns, and it outputs an answer, and people call that artificial intelligence. I would say that's probably 99% of all AI today. What we were working on is we realized that just learning the patterns of history is not enough to try and predict a future in a conflict zone. Because if all you're putting into a model is conflict, then all it's going to output will be conflict too. So how do you get a model that only knows conflict to predict peace? And how can you then go, well, I want that peace. How can I get to this peaceful life? That becomes basically impossible from doing that. So you need to take a different approach. So what we started doing was we started looking at what are the other parts of the brain, not just language, that help us to make decisions? How does emotion play in? How do things like morality play in? And how do those operate, right? How can we create an AI system that's more human-like? Maybe it can't speak so well. The early systems didn't have any language at all in them. They couldn't produce any language. Later systems can do some language production if we need them to. It's surprisingly rare, though. And so this is one of the reasons why we were able to start doing this a really long time ago. And people are now trying to catch up to agentic AI. It's everywhere. Every other LinkedIn post on my feed isn't about agentic AI or OpenClaw or these sorts of different things that are happening, and now they have their own social networks. And for me, we started doing this in 2013 pretty aggressively at this agentic AI approach. But what we realize is you have to just make it more human. And if you make it more human, it gets more simple computationally, but it gets more complicated socially.
Yes, so about the social aspect or about the emotional aspect, how did you put it in your systems? Because every nation is different.
Definitely. And so, well, just like you said, right? Every nation is different. everything is in its own sort of cultural context. So what's really interesting about humans is that even though we all grow up in different cultures, different languages, different religions and traditions and rituals and all of these different things, our basic software that we run in the brain is the same across all of those cultures. So everyone is afraid of loud noises. Everyone has a natural predisposition, towards looking at people's faces, for example, right? Facial recognition. Everyone has a predisposition towards like their parents, right? And that like mother-child bond, for example. Those are things that we have not because we learned them, but because we evolved as humans to be like that. And so it's something that all of humanity shares. But then the interesting part is that if you can build that architecture, right? If you can build that scaffolding of what all humans share, you then get to fill it with whatever culture you want, right? So for me, it's almost like artificial intelligence should be approached like a glass or a bowl, is that, it takes the shape in a way that we don't have a choice. It's just the way we've evolved. But the liquid that you put in it, maybe it's a Slovak liquid, maybe it's an American liquid or a British liquid. Those give the different flavors, and that can be done through learning, just the same way it is in our brain.
Yeah, I've read that you put 93 psychological dimensions. What are some of the most surprising ones that actually predict conflict?
Morality. Morality is the one that stands out, I think, the most for me. Part of that is because we have a lot of things on like emotion that are there, right? Anger and anxiety and sadness. And those emotions, of course, do predict certain aspects of conflict. But what I found was really interesting, particularly over the last like 5 or 6 years, we've seen this consistently, that misalignments of moral issues are what really make up these sorts of like initial stages of conflict and really motivate people, because morality is one of those things that you really hold internally as a person. Like you can't buy someone's morality, right? If you can, it was just their opinion, right? And so because you can't buy someone's morality and it's really where you stand as a person, if someone attacks that, or if you meet someone who views something differently, it immediately creates tensions. And that's one of the things that we see consistently across conflicts as major issues of morality, both between different groups as well as within groups. Like the polarization that we see, particularly in some of the data that we have in like looking at social media in the United States in particular, right, is one that I'm quite familiar with. That's one where moral issues are constantly creating this sort of like rift in society where the two sides are just on one side or the other, and they don't want to kind of meet in the middle on some of those issues. There's been some really interesting research by a psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, who does a lot of work on social media now too. His earlier work was on moral foundations, and is really that's the basis of the work that I also do in morality as well. And what he found is that in the United States, people who are more conservative and people who are more liberal have different moral signatures, right? Everybody cares about harm and fairness as moral issues. But there are these other issues about authority and who's in your in-group and things like purity and religion that typically only conservatives care about. And he was able to show that these things cluster really, really well in the United States, but they also seem to cluster in other parts of the world as well. And it almost seems like it may be one of these evolved sorts of things where we have an evolved morality that our cultures, are always dealing with all of the time. But then once we all got in the same place on social media and we started talking to one another and people started talking about, the things you're not supposed to speak about at the pub, right? Like religion and politics, they started to realize that there were differences, and those got exacerbated by social media algorithms and things like that. So morality we see top to bottom, not just in like hot conflicts or like wars, but also in the social and cultural conflicts that we see in polarization today.
Well, let's move on to the actual conflict.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned in my intro, you've been like involved in a scientific way in one of the most violent conflict right now, and it's like it's Israel and Palestine conflict. Walk me through what happens when you take on a new conflict. You sign a contract with the UN.
Mhm.
What's the first thing you do? And where does the data come from?
Yeah, so the first thing that we do whenever we sign a contract, so the first thing we do whenever we sign a contract in a conflict zone is we try and set up immediately a core group of people that can work with us. And these are people that are on the ground, that have a lifetime of experience that they can bring to bear on what we're doing. The sort of way I like to, I say it jokingly, but I also take it very seriously, is that we're just tech support for peace. Right? We aren't experts in Israel-Palestine. We aren't experts in Bosnia. We aren't experts in a lot of places. But we are able to provide tools that can help experts on the ground to make those decisions. And I think that, the way that I've started to look at it more recently is that that's exactly, I think, where I want to be. Because from a business perspective, we want to try and create value. And when I look at the largest scale of the world right now, there's information everywhere. Every time in our phones, it's just we have unlimited information that's attached to us now. And with, LLMs and chatbots that are on smartwatches, I mean, you don't even need to have your phone on you anymore, basically. It's just at your beck and call. Infinite information. But there's very little knowledge. So despite all of the information in the world, there's not that many things that we actually know and can try to bring to bear to solve a problem. But then of all of the other things, right, even of all of the knowledge that we do have through advanced studies in all of the universities, there's even less wisdom in the world. And that ability to understand what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and what you can do and what you can't do, oftentimes is not based in knowledge. It's based in experience. And for me, that sort of experience on the ground in conflict zones, that's wisdom. That's what keeps people safe, right? Particularly when you're working in those sorts of areas. Having someone who has the wisdom to know better than to go into certain neighborhoods at certain times, that's what keeps you safe, right? And so working with those people is absolutely critical, because I don't think AI will ever really give us wisdom that's any valuable. But I do think AI, and particularly the AI that we're working on, can take information and can make it knowledge that's useful. But then you still are always going to need things like community leaders to actually implement the knowledge and have their wisdom filter out, well, the AI said this and this and this and this. And honestly, that might be statistically true, but it's going to be a dumb idea and I'm never going to be able to do it. So we're not going to touch it. These other three ideas, those might be kind of cool. Let's go with those, right? And so that wisdom, I think, is really, really important. So the first thing we always do is try and set up a core group of people who will work with us hand in hand, regular meetings where they're getting the updates. They're also helping to shape how we use the AI to ensure that we're actually addressing problems in a way that can be really, really useful. Beyond that, we then set up an advisory group, which include all of those core group members, but it also includes people like stakeholders, NGOs, people who are skeptical in the organizations. Oftentimes there's a very important director who says, oh, we've heard of AI and we don't like sentiment analysis. And I have to explain to them, we are not doing sentiment analysis. We are far beyond sentiment analysis now. But they're skeptical, and I think they're right to be skeptical. It's good to be skeptical about AI, particularly given what you see on the internet these days. So for me, that becomes an interesting position to bring in skeptics as well and bring them to the table. And then from there, we work with them and we scope out exactly what's going to happen, what we're going to build, how we're going to test and make sure that it works, and then start building it out that way, gathering whatever data we have access to, and then building out the models and trying to do the predictions and then validating those, right? Making sure that our predictions are useful predictions, not just a number that comes out from the equations, right?
Yeah.
How do you know that number actually means something useful or could potentially be right? That's most of the work. It's actually more goes into validation that goes into building the models most of the time.
Yeah, and most of the time there is no time to test the ideas when it comes to conflicts. Like you need to implement the findings ASAP.
Yeah. Oh, a lot of times it's one of those issues where particularly in conflict zones, it's so high risk. Even if you're just dealing with communications, it's still really high risk because you don't want to communicate something that's only going to inflame tensions, right? You want to communicate something that gets everybody to kind of calm down and see what can be done to find a viable solution. And so in all of those areas, you want to act quickly, but not too quickly. So there is a time pressure. In some areas, particularly in conflicts that have been ongoing for a really, really long time, there is more of a feeling of we can take our time because it's been ongoing for so long, and it's almost in like a stalemate. And what they're looking for is, what's the idea we haven't tried that might be able to unlock a pathway to peace? And that becomes a really interesting positioning, because it gives you the ability to make sure, and you don't have the pressure of, I need that yesterday. You wish you had it yesterday, because that time is very valuable particularly to people who live in those conflicts. So as we kind of move forward with it, we do always try and keep that there, but time is always of the essence. There's always a time pressure. It never gets easy.
Let's stay on this topic for a while, because I'm still interested in the data.
Yeah.
And how do you collect it? Because I know sometimes it's articles, it's social media comments, it can be whatever, it's online.
Survey data.
Yeah, survey data.
Data that could come from a potential client, like all sorts of data. So the system that I developed is designed specifically to be flexible. I design it to learn like a person so that it represents a person. And it's much better with texts than anything else. So I do have a nice little trick that I like to do as a demonstration sometimes on stage, where it's a voice demo where it uses my real-time audio feed and shows people how it learns and how it can pull out my psychology in real time. But that's not something that we actually really deploy on the projects. It's generally unnecessary to deploy that on the projects, but it looks really fun on stage sometimes. So I'll do it that way. From data sources, we try and pull in whatever we can find that's relevant, useful, and available to be used. So news articles are great because there's more of them than people realize. In one of the earlier studies that we did, where we partnered with Cambridge University and the Wolf Institute and different stakeholders in Northern Ireland to study what worked and what didn't work in the peace processes in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, and in South Sudan, I think we pulled in somewhere around 50 million articles for that project. Now we are opened up into 2 different data streams for media articles, where we are dealing with hundreds of millions of articles, and they have automated data streams that come in. So we can kind of say, what's going on today. If we have a meeting, for example, with a potential NGO somewhere, I can check in and see, like, what's going on. Is there any big issue that I should know about before I start this call? And it gives you a little bit of the situation on the ground to have that. So that's a bread and butter kind of data pipeline for us, our news articles. We are, of course, doing work also in like helping businesses to communicate with people. And for that, social media is great because people live their lives on social media. And so if you need to know, how do you talk to these millions of people that could potentially, use a product, being able to do that with a psychologically realistic version of your client base or of your audience becomes a really, really powerful tool. So we can, take that data, analyze that data, and create that digital twin of the audience or the market so that people can stress test their branding against that digital twin the same way that peacemakers can stress test a peace deal against the digital twin of a conflict zone.
Okay, so let's say you take, 20 million profiles on Facebook that are following, they're fans of some sports team, and you can say how they will act when the sports team will win or will lose.
You could. I don't think you need AI for that, though.
I'm just trying to simplify
the interesting
thing,
right, would be when America and Slovakia faced each other in the Olympics. Who was I going to root for? If your AI can predict that, it becomes much more interesting, right? Because if you know what the audience is there for, you already kind of know what they like. So this is one of the reasons why I think Reddit is such an interesting and valuable data source. The people who are involved in, let's say, the 3D printing subreddits, they're there because they like 3D printing. The people in the PC gaming subreddits are there because they like gaming on a PC. So if something goes wrong, right? So if you're looking at the Slovan subreddit or something like that, and they lose or they win, you know what the sentiment's going to be. The question would be, whether they win or lose, how could you still communicate with them something interesting about future tickets or future games and these sorts of things? And with that, there's so many different things about people that become really interesting from an AI perspective when it gets down to how do you quantify, how do you measure these issues? And when you take, for example, a sporting event, if you really, really love a team and that team loses, but you had a lot of fun at the game, is it positive or is it negative, right? And the answer is, most of the time, it's actually both, because people can consistently hold positive and negative emotions in their mind at the same time, right? And we do it about sports, we do it about people, right? You can think of past friends that someone may have had, or like an ex that they've had, where they're going to have positive memories, and then obviously they're going to have negative memories about that person. And so that's something that's uniquely human that AI often struggles to deal with.
But with what you said, the question came up to my mind. Can you take this sentiment from news articles? Because I don't know. I think some news articles can hold a really emotional tension, but some are just news articles. They don't have any emotions in them.
Yes. Sadly, I would say increasingly news articles have more and more emotion written into them. It's less about the facts and more about sort of this tacit emotion that gets slipped in. You can glean emotion from news articles, and I think that there's an interesting aspect to that, particularly when you look at the news articles from like the largest media sources in a country, because they're trying to capture and engage with an audience as well, right? News and the media is typically not a nonprofit endeavor, right? There are some that are backed with funds from governments, for example, like NPR in the United States, the BBC, and others. But most of the major news outlets are doing it because they're engaging an audience. And so there is often an emotional tone there that is useful to understand an audience. And then particularly when you're dealing with larger geopolitical issues, those become very interesting because the same event will be written about very differently depending on which side of a conflict you are. And it's not always about the positive or negative sentiment, right? The moral issues that are involved there, and what are the core themes of things like friendship or family and the work-life balance, achievements. How do those things play into a particular narrative can also be very country specific, or within a country can also be indicative of polarization. So when you look at the American media, the same thing, it's one thing that happened. It's one event in reality. But the way that left-wing versus right-wing media talk about it, it's the exact opposite. It's almost like two different things have happened. And so that becomes really indicative, for example, of polarization in a country, is if you see part of the audience reacting positively to something, and then the same event creating a negative reaction in the other part of that audience becomes a very clear polarization signal.
But when it comes to social media, can you track an individual when you are looking at like large group of people? Maybe could you tell I'm the model for your training?
So the great thing about the work that we've done, and this comes from the fact that we started as academics working in psychology departments and anthropology departments, is from the very beginning, when you're doing this kind of work, you have to make sure that everything is anonymized and adheres to like experimental standards in the way that it operates. With our system, because it doesn't learn the way that a traditional AI system does, like, a ChatGPT or Meta or Google, where they have to take all of the data that they have about you and feed that into a model hundreds or thousands or millions of times in order for it to get a good AI system. Because our system can go through and just start pulling in and reading and understanding the text. We actually don't need all of that same metadata and all of that same, what they call PII, personally identifiable information. We don't need the same data in our system to get it to operate, even at scale.
Okay, and you said you have like 90% predictive accuracy.
So,
and yeah.
I was going to say, so our benchmark, not to jump ahead of you, our benchmark is 95% confidence in everything that we put out. So in the work that we do, or in the dashboard, for example, that does media monitoring and analysis for clients, we always try and hold that 95% confidence interval. And this, again, just goes back to being giant university nerds, is if you're going to get something published in the scientific literature, you have to be able to say that it's reached a 95% confidence interval. So if you were to do something 100 times, 95 of those times, it's going to do what you say it does. 5% of the time, maybe not. And so for us, we always tried to hold that as our core standard. So when we're looking, for example, and trying to see, is there a relationship between, this kind of morality and a conflict? If we're going to be putting that out, we want to try and make sure that we're 95% confident that is something that is actually realistic in the world. So we use a lot of advanced stats in the background to make sure that we can't just say what is, we can also say how reliable it is. And if it's not, then, we try and just focus on the good information that we can push out to people.
And what about the 5%? What does a failure look like in your system?
Typically, it's something that we're not going to be highlighting or showing, right? There's a danger in showing somebody something that's not real, particularly if you're in a high-risk situation for communications or conflict. If I were to show somebody a relationship between, let's say, some idea of finance, right, and morality, they could make a policy decision based on that. But if that's not actually reliable, then we need to make sure that they know that that's not something actually that you should be basing a decision off of. So that's one of the things that when it does fall on that other 5%, we get to highlight that as well and say, let's make sure we don't go down the wrong pathway here as best as we can.
When I was doing the research for this interview, I read, I think that you said that AI cannot and should not try to be fully objective. So explain that, because a lot of people, it can sound like a justification for building biased system. And it's like really like problem for many communities.
It can be. And I would say, I'll ask you a bit of a clarification question on that. In what areas would we want an unbiased system or a biased system like that, right? Are we looking at misinformation, or are we looking at general use? Because those can be two very different things.
Well, yeah, like general use, it should be unbiased. But when you are talking about misinformation, I will ask you about your work in this field later. So probably you need to adjust it a little bit to be able to communicate differently with one group and another. I don't know.
So, yeah, I would say that one of the dirty secrets of artificial intelligence is that almost every machine learning system is biased. One of the reasons why I have been very outspoken in terms of saying that biases are okay really come down to two aspects of what those biases mean. When I'm building a system about conflict, for example, and we're making it so that an actor has an in-group, out-group bias, right? So it will do positive things to its in-group, but it might do something negative towards someone who's outside of their group. That's very human. That's exactly what we're seeing on the ground. So if we created an AI system that was never biased, we would never be able to predict conflict. We also would never be able to predict peace. And so to be able to understand how peace works, right, or how things could get better or how a conflict could get worse, you need to understand the biases that humans have. And understanding human biases become very enlightening. And the very same things that can hurt us in the real world become extremely valuable in a more synthetic digital world, where if things go wrong, we can turn it off and turn it back on again until we find a good solution. But without very real and human biases in the AI systems, you're actually not going to be able to get the initial results that you would need to have a positive impact in the world.
And who decides which biases are used or not?
It depends on the application, really. Generally, there are a team of psychologists and developers, people who are trained on which biases need to be put in and which biases don't, and how they should be weighted that go into the systems. But because humans are biased, I think models of humans should also be biased. Where it becomes a problem, I think, is when these systems are being put to use in different places. Because a lot of times I think a lot of the AI, particularly in the more traditional machine learning domain, is great for research, but it's not great for production. It's not fit for the real world. It's fit to be a lens that actually shows something about humanity. And if it shows us something negative about humanity, we need to consider what that means before we put it out in the real world. So, for example, there's been a lot of work that's been done on like biases in AI systems around issues of race, right? Also issues of hiring in HR, around issues of like gender and even the socioeconomic class that you might come from. Those systems get trained on a bunch of data, and then it comes out with an answer, and then a company can go, yep, cool, there you go, and they ship it. And what they don't realize is that there are biases in those systems, and the biases in those systems have a negative impact on society when they're deployed at scale. What I think those AI systems are good for is research, though, because they take a massive humanity-wide mirror and they hold it up to ourselves and they go, we've looked at all the data on the internet, anything you've digitized, we have now analyzed. And here are all of your biases. And that's a mirror that we can hold up to ourselves so long as we take it seriously and try and better ourselves from there. Putting that sort of a product into deployment is not bettering ourselves, I think. But I also think that there's a time and place where we need to understand when those biases do become useful. And I think when you're trying to solve conflict, sadly, conflicts happen because of biases. So our models need to include biases too.
So let's talk about the actual projects. Now, we mentioned a little your work for the UN. And I was reading one article and it said that you or your colleague, that you were present in the West Bank and that you were stopped at the checkpoint. What was going through your mind then? That it's like really dangerous zone in the world right now. How did that moment maybe change anything about your model or your company?
Yeah, so there was a time myself and the co-founder were in the West Bank for the work that we were doing with the UN. And there were checkpoints. There are a lot of security checkpoints throughout the West Bank, and many of which we slowed down to go through and all of those things. And they can be nerve-wracking, I would say personally. They're armed checkpoints, of course. There was one particular story that I know my co-founder has spoken about in public where they were pulled over and held on the side of the road for some hours as well. And it can be very nerve-wracking when you're put in those positions. Sometimes you kind of get used to them. There's a lot of times where I've been in what I would consider very nerve-wracking positions with ex-combatants, former paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, for example, where you're around the leadership teams that are kept with very secure by their own groups. And those can be very nerve-wracking situations when you're sort of on the ground there. And you learn how to deal with it. You learn what to do and what not to do pretty quickly. And thankfully, in places like, that we're not as familiar with, like Bosnia and the West Bank and things like that, there's always been, the ability to have somebody locally who can help us out if we need to.
Yeah. Like the human touch and human contact every time it's needed.
That social rapport you get with people is absolutely required. And I can think in Northern Ireland as well, like one of the ways I was able to start talking with some of the organizations that are involved in de-radicalization or ex-combatants, former prisoners of the conflict there, and what's going on in some of the paramilitaries there. It was all done through human contact, right? You can't just email someone who spent 15 years in jail and go, hey, I'd like to ask you some questions. They're like, who are you? Like, get out of here, right? But when you have a mutual contact or a friend of a friend, make an introduction for you, or someone that they've worked with in the past, make an introduction, and they learn what you're about, that can really open up people to share with you things that they wouldn't otherwise share. And when you do get that real human information, right, you definitely want to make a note of it, because that oftentimes is the gold that's found that you can put into these predictive models and really test that out. That becomes far more valuable than anything that you get from, 300 million articles.
Yeah. But you started the project and then it was stalled. You didn't get to initiate the phase 2. So
the one in Palestine.
Yeah, the one in Palestine. So it's the hard question actually. But if the model had been fully operational before the attack on October 7, do you think it could prevent the attack, or it was too soon to do something?
What I would say is that you can give all of the information to decision makers. It's up to them to make the decision. Could our model have helped understand conflict risks? I'm quite confident it's been quite useful in that area, particularly before. But whether or not those insights are put to use is where we as tech support, that's where our job ends and the job on the ground begins. Yeah, and do you think it could be restarted, or right now it's just frozen and because of the political climate you can't work on it? Oh, I can definitely say I hope so. I'm quite proud of the work that we've done regarding Israel-Palestine. I would love to do more work and try and help there for sure. Naturally, the situation being what it is on the ground there, it's better than it was, but there's still a lot of work to be done, I think, before there's more concerted, effort to try and engage with, new approaches. There's a lot of rebuilding that's being done in these things. That's all over the news, but I surely hope so. I would love for us to be able to do a phase 2 with them. Yep. So let's talk about the situation where it worked and you were able to finish it. And it's Northern Ireland, for example. And you predicted that the post-Brexit Irish Sea border would cause violence, like in that area, months before it actually happened. Mm-hmm. So walk me through exactly what the model saw before it happened. Yeah. So the model in particular was quite interesting because we designed it to look at something in Northern Ireland called the peace walls. And the peace walls are literal physical walls that were built in Belfast to keep the two communities away from each other so that the Catholic and the Protestant communities wouldn't be able to fight. And so they created walls that segregated Catholics and Protestants throughout the city. And the walls still exist today. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that the walls are taller today than they were when the peace agreement was signed. So these walls have actually been growing since the peace was signed in order to try and ensure the peace. And there's a massive debate about whether or not those walls should come down. So we started looking at what segregation effects might have on Northern Ireland. When Brexit was passed and became more of an issue, I started to think, well, this also is going to inevitably involve some kind of economic, geopolitical segregation, not a physical barrier necessarily, but either an Irish Sea border or some kind of border between the counties there in Northern Ireland and then the counties in the Republic of Ireland in the south. So where they draw that border becomes an interesting question. And what we found is that the borders don't necessarily matter. That the physical borders are not really the issue. The identities are very much the issue. And that if they're going to create a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, that those on the Catholic side are going to view this as a violation of the Good Friday Agreement, where it says you cannot have a border there, and that they are going to be the ones that are more likely to be activated. But that if you do it between an Irish Sea border, the Protestant or Loyalist community who identify with the United Kingdom and with the Crown and being British, they're going to be the ones that now feel cheated from the agreement, and that they are going to be the ones that are more likely to start recruitment and potentially be activated towards conflict. So that was one of those really interesting things where we were doing that. We reanalyzed some data and basically found that the proposals on the table and where things were going in the discussion around Brexit was going to likely lead to an increase in activation in the loyalist community. And that is by and large exactly what's been observed, not just within the few months after we made the prediction, but continuously since then as well.
Yeah, but what happened after that? Did anyone listen? What about the politics? Because you can't, be active on your own. You can't go there and resolve the
right.
conflict.
What am I just going to stand and wave my hands in the middle of the street and hope for the best? No, it has led to increased engagement with people that are involved there, both NGOs, de-radicalization groups, groups that are stakeholders, people that operate within government there to, give them the intelligence that they need. And naturally that then goes on to further discussions that I'm not part of, right? Because when it comes to something as important as the geopolitics of how to both respect the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland and figure out how the UK, which is, the governing jurisdiction over Northern Ireland, can leave the European Union while Ireland, which cannot have a border with Northern Ireland, remains part of the European Union. That is a very complex discussion. I'm not invited to that table.
Well, we will see.
I would happily help and sit if I could. If I'm needed, they know where to find me. But that's such a high level geopolitical conversation. Yeah. They haven't brought me into that one yet.
Also, you worked on a very interesting project during the COVID pandemic in Norway. So the Norwegian government didn't want to censor the misinformation or false information on social media, but understand why people share it. And then you came up. What did you actually find? What makes someone to spread conspiracy theories and false information?
Yeah, so that project was a really interesting one because it happened during COVID. Most governments don't really have as much power to censor and moderate content because most of them are platforms in the United States, for example, and they're trying to be as cooperative as they can. When you're looking at that, ultimately, though, you're looking at just a flood of misinformation and conspiracy theory. And the only thing that's ever going to be faster than AI is going to be the human brain. And by the time you've read something, it's already too late. You've already absorbed that information. So there needs to be a better understanding of why do people look at something and decide, yes, I'm going to share that information without trying to, get into the discussion that I think distracted a lot of us around COVID of what is and is not misinformation. Because I think that then became a discussion around sort of the truthiness, to use Stephen Colbert's term, the truthiness of information, when in reality it was never about what a fact was or what was scientifically valid. It was about what made you feel a certain way. And ultimately, these are the things that lead to people believing in conspiracies and misinformation, is that it's information that resonates with them based on where they are in their life. There's a lot of people who I think are really frustrated in their lives. And when humans, really when all primates, right, are anxious, we start to look for others around us who can help us in the world. And we try and, circle our little tribe so that we can do something. The world has not gotten any easier over the last 25, 30 years, but it has gotten easier to communicate. So our ability to find people who believe like us and share information, that's become quite simple and quite easy and quite cheap to do. So that has laid the groundwork for the ability for misinformation and disinformation to spread based on your prior beliefs, your identity, whether or not it fits narratives you already believe. But narratives don't need to be true for anybody to believe them, right? Facts, of course, right? It's very difficult to deny certain things. It's difficult to deny that the sky is blue, right? Maybe you go outside, but if you tell someone that the sky is red, right? Outside of sunrise and sunset, you don't have a very good chance of winning that argument, right? There's observation of the world. Living in the world can debunk certain facts. But facts about your identity and who you are and the narratives that you believe in, the stories that you like, the way that you feel about certain things, those are much harder to prove or disprove. And in some cases, you just fundamentally can't. And I think that's one of the reasons why it makes it so powerful, right? Is that things that cannot be disproven can become extremely easy to share, easy to believe, and then very binding. And I think this is something that's very similar to how our minds evolved to love friends and family. We also have evolved to love narratives, and we've evolved to have these identities based on narratives. And when you look at humans around the world today, I think there's a massive comparison to be made with sort of the work that I was doing very, very early on in my career on religions. Religions are also based on facts that or narratives that you cannot ever prove or disprove, right? So you can never say that a religious belief is a fact. That's the main difference between fact and faith, right? Is you have faith that these things are true and you use them to define yourself. That's very much what we saw happening during the COVID misinformation area. And you did see some of them become very religious, right? Where, some of the groups in like QAnon, quite famously, for example, right? They have a very, what we would call messianic view of Donald Trump, right? They view him as almost like this very religious figure that's been sent by God to enact certain things. And I think that that's not a coincidence. I think that's the way our brains are designed. Moving from, conspiracy to religion it's the same parts of the brain that are being activated there, right? It's the same mechanisms of belief that are operating there. So it becomes very useful to approach it that way.
My last question on this topic, then we moved a little bit on business model and investors. Because of all what you said, you can build digital twin of a society. Mm-hmm. And the question is, I know that you said that you refuse to work with the political parties and so on to encourage their, their status or their chances to win, so they will say the what people want to hear. But nowadays you have your technology in your hand and you want to use it as you said for peacemaking. But when let's say somebody will buy it, it's still a startup. What would you say? What if it gets in authoritarian hands?
So it's definitely a concern that I've always been worried about, right? When I was doing, early research, realizing, the power of this potential technology was one of the things, of course, that I think everyone needs to worry about, or what are the ethical repercussions of it. For us, we've always been very careful about who we work with and who we allow access to the technology. We have only ever really focused, for example, on EU and NATO countries. We've had basically in our terms of service and in the documents of the company, going back to even before 2022, saying, we will not work with organizations that have, beneficial ownership in places like Russia and China and things like this. We wouldn't be able to sleep at night. The book that I wrote on AI and religion has a whole section on the use of this technology and its ethics, and how it could be deployed by authoritarian regimes, and why it is that it needs to therefore be protected in that sort of a sense. Now, in the event of an exit scenario, I do think that we can ensure that a number of ways. One of which is I've been very careful to make sure that the investors that have joined the company are ethically aligned with the decisions that I've made and the decisions that I intend on making. And sometimes that means leaving revenue on the table in order to say no and walk away from a contract. And I've been quite lucky, I guess. Maybe that's the word for it. I've been quite fortunate that the investors know that we have walked on certain contracts, and they've always backed us, and they've said, good, and I tell them, look, this happened, I'm not going to take it. And they go, good. So in the event of an exit scenario, it looks like all of the shareholders at CulturePulse are agreed That's not something that we want to do. And it's something that I think we could protect as well by being discerning on who we would sell it out to, as well as ensuring that all of the different contingencies that are actually put on startups when they exit, right? The founder has to go and work at the new company for a few years and take on a new position. I don't know that I will ever be completely hands off with the technology that we've created at this point. I think that in the event of an acquisition, I'll probably still be there to help steer the ship.
And what about every day there is some kind of hacker related kind of thing? Do you think like can you assure the safeguards around your system considered China or Russia hackers?
As best as anyone can. Yeah, there's even certain things that we've gone to that are an interesting and unique benefit to our technology, right? So for example, because our technology can learn in real time, which is not something that other AI systems can do. You have to feed the data back through it multiple times and go through these, what they call training epochs. Our system, because it can make sense of the data the first time it sees it, it means it doesn't have to remember the data. So if you are putting a policy into our system, for example, it doesn't remember it. It's been designed to forget it before someone could potentially get into it, right? So we can sleep well at night knowing that even if there was something that got into someone was able to get into the system, there's not going to be a peace policy there to find. There's no government policies there to find because we don't need to store them. And the best security is nobody can steal it if you don't have it. But it is something I take very seriously because the hackers out there in the world are way better than people think. I think people are not nearly afraid of hackers the way they need to be. Like that's a profession, and thankfully there are white hat hackers as well that are trying to do the good work, and the gray hat hackers as well. Oftentimes, right? They're ultimately trying to do the good work. They just email you for money after they already hacked your system. But there is work that I think should be done. I think people should take it super seriously.
Yeah, that would be for another podcast if we talk about cybersecurity.
Yeah. But this is I think that's one of the fears that people don't have in society enough.
Exactly.
I look at what goes viral that people are afraid of, and I'm sitting there and like one of these days you're going to figure out how good these hackers are, and that's really going to scare you.
Yeah, that's something I will think about today.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure. Okay, so we are still a Forbes podcast, so let's talk about a little bit about business also. Last year, you raised $1.5 million.
Correct.
If I'm not.
Yep, that's correct.
But for a deep tech company with a global ambition, it can be a relatively small round, but a Slovak company,
extremely small round. Yeah,
it's like kind of good. Let's be honest. What does that money actually buy you?
Yeah. For us, a lot of it was funding that we were looking at to execute our go-to-market strategy, particularly in trying to engage businesses with the technology and helping them to understand what we're doing in the branding space. Because so much of our technology, I built when I was still doing research and built it before, it wasn't that we came with a deep tech pitch deck and then said, we're going to build this thing. I think we could do it. We came basically saying, we already built this thing. We know we can do it, which typically in a deep tech timeline, there's kind of the joke, right? You're looking at like 10 years on $100 million in order to get it there. I started first publishing about this sort of work and did the first, publication that utilizes the kind of approach that we're doing in 2017. So it has been about 10 years. And we've gotten a lot of research grants and things that we've done over the years to hone that technology in. And that allows us to kind of jump ahead in the deep tech deployment timeline. While everybody got really caught up with large language models and trying to create some cryptocurrency a few years ago, for us, we were really still just focused on, no, this is something that we know is going to be able to really fundamentally change how people operate, how businesses operate, for example. And so we were able to kind of jump through that. So even though in the deep tech sense, $1.5 million is absolutely nothing in that realm, right? Yep. In the Slovak startup space, 1.5 million is a respectable number, and that supplements the nearly 1 million pre-seed round that we did with a Slovak investor as well as 0100. Right, they were our very first investor was here in Bratislava, and so even with let's say 2.5 million in funding to date, a lot of that has really been focused not so much on the technology, but building out the team that we can use to take this to market. And as we look forward, trying to do a much larger round in the future. This is something where we're, again, really focused on the go-to-market strategy, but then also making sure we have a tech team in place here at the headquarters in Bratislava to support all of the different businesses and organizations across the EU that we could try and help. And that's going to take a lot more developers. So we'll probably need a much bigger office than we currently have here in Bratislava. But in that area, I'm very ambitious in trying to hope to raise one of the largest rounds, I think, that people would have seen in a Slovak company.
So right now you are aiming to Series A.
Yeah, I am going to start looking to raise Series A in the future. This is something that I already am spending some time. I'm already losing sleep over the Series A. Yes.
Is it because there is not as much money in this region or capital, and you are aiming for, I am assuming, foreign VC funds?
So, well, we're very Eurocentric as a company, right? We're very European focused. Our headquarters has been in Bratislava from the beginning. And so, Bratislava, London. So throughout the EU, there's plenty of money. There's a lot of money in Europe, and there's a lot of money for AI in Europe too, right? The European Commission is been putting a lot of money into it. So there's a lot of momentum going into this angle, I think. Doesn't make it any easier to get, right? Fundraising is always a very hard business for any founder. But we are going for like a much larger eight-digit round that we're hoping to raise. But I do think that we can do it. Happy to have international money in on this. But for the most part, all of our fundraising has been focused in Europe.
And you mentioned that your goal is 100 million users and 100 million in revenue.
So, if I may, just correct real quick. The 100 million by 100 million actually started with 100 million lives positively impacted and $100 million in revenue.
Okay, so
yeah. 100 so maybe not so many.
Okay, so not users, but 100 millions positively impacted lives and 100 millions in revenue. But my question is aimed right now more for the revenue. When you are working with governments or UN, it's kind of hard to scale because the long sales cycles, changing policies, like also the thing happened with the UN before when they stalled the project in Israel and Palestine. What's the actual path to those numbers? Can you achieve it just with these projects, or you need to do like side business besides the peacemaking?
No, I would say that what we need to do is just make what we're already doing more efficient, right? And productize it more efficiently. Creating platforms where people can do this in ways that, myself and others at the company are more hands-off, so that if you need to do things like message optimization or understand an audience for your business, that you can go through and utilize, for example, the data that a business already has, right? Telecom companies, automotive industry, these are massive industries in Europe, and they already have a lot of data already about their customers that we could help them to unlock. And this would allow us to just run our system over their data that they already have and to give them the insights that they would need to better serve those customers. From that, it allows us to create a revenue pathway to 100 million euros that's actually quite obtainable, I think. If we had 100 million users, we'd have probably closer to $1 billion in revenue, which I'm not against that either. But I think when it comes to having 100 million lives positively impacted, for me, I'm much more interested in that peacekeeping and B2G aspect of it. Those sorts of deals are very difficult to get, and they have massively long sales cycles, and they need to fit a specific requirement for a government before they want to engage with you, right? They need to have the need, right? Nobody's buying shoes if all your shoes are fine. That's not true, actually. The idea of it, though, being that when a government comes out and says we need something, then they go to a company that could potentially provide it. a lot of governments are now realizing that one of the things that they need the most are things like social resilience and helping them to understand their population and creating policies that really serve their people. And those are really positive impacts, right? So I think we actually could get to 100 million positive lives positively impacted and 100 million in revenue. It's not going to be easy, but I don't think it's going to be much harder than it already is.
And what about B2B sales? Do you have customers in this area or not
Yeah,
right
it's
now?
not nearly as mature as what we do
Okay.
in the government space, but it is something that we've been pushing and trying to grow. And that's something we've been looking at, not just locally, but also internationally, and trying to reach out more towards your top end companies. So focusing really on those sort of Fortune 100 style, Fortune 500 style companies, because they're the ones that have the biggest need. They're also the ones that are the most open to engaging with a company that historically has done large projects with big name clients as well, like NATO and the UN and these sorts of organizations, where they're getting 1 million emails a day to help them with their message optimization from 1 million different people with ChatGPT APIs and saying that they have the ability to do this miraculous technology. Those people are just swatted away like flies by most of these organizations. We have a very unique proposition that we can offer them. It is a harder sales cycle than going down market in the marketing and B2B space. Like, right, if we could just go and do a quick little tool for a bunch of agencies, it might be better short term, but I think long term it would distract us from the goal of creating an actual, like, really, really sustainable, large tech company.
I have a little personal questions because I think our audience is curious, like, because usually it goes the way I'm interviewing Slovak people who lives in US and building startups there, and this is vice versa. You're from US and living in Slovakia. So why?
So why in Slovakia?
Yeah.
Well, originally, when I was at Oxford, I met my wife. And so we were actually introduced through the executive vice president at CulturePulse. So we've all known each other for many, many years. So met my wife there at Oxford, and eventually, in about 10 years ago, settled in Bratislava. What was at the time we were saying was going to be temporary. We were going to go move somewhere else. And so I've been temporarily here for 9, almost 10 years. But no, I honestly, I really like it here. There's a lot of work to be done here. And I think there's a lot of work I can do here, a lot of things I could help with, both in obviously the company being here. That was a very strategic decision that was made. And we can expand from here quite easily. I mean, Bratislava is very close to Vienna, has its own airport. I can get to London by lunchtime if I need to, for meetings and things like that. We can also travel internationally quite quickly out of Vienna. There's a lot of cost of living reasons, like OPEX, what basically ends up being OPEX expenses on the business, that make it a very efficient place to start a business, so long as you can find the talent that really believes in your message. And that's been one of the biggest things as we're shifting gears into becoming a much larger company and going for a more ambitious foothold in the market, is not even necessarily looking at, okay, who can do the job, but who's going to want to do the job, right? Who are the people that can wake up and say, I actually believe in this mission. I am going to make sure that, like, I am there with the team and be part of this team that has this really, really big vision of what they can do. Because a lot of people are happy to show up for a paycheck, but they're not so happy to show up, on the long nights when everybody else is still in the office. And we've been putting together a great team. A lot of the new hires at the company are absolute superstars that we've brought in who are not just there because they like the job and it's like good enough. They're there because they actually believe in the mission and they believe in the other team and the management team that we have. So it's becoming an interesting platform for that kind of growth.
Well, and the final question, we were talking theoretically in many ways at the beginning of this podcast, but let's wrap this up also in a philosophical way. Do you think, or if you have to bet, does AI actually help us build a more peaceful world, or does it just give us more sophisticated ways to understand how we destroy each other?
Yeah, that is a good question. So let me answer it this way. it's almost certain that AI gives us more advanced ways to understand how we destroy each other. But if we have a tool that understands why we would do that and how we would do that, then does that not give us a perfectly lighted pathway to make a different decision and go down a different pathway and actually create a society that's better for us? Because it's not going to be AI's decision whether or not society gets better or worse, just like it's not social media's decision about whether or not society gets better or worse. Ultimately, it's our decision collectively, like all of us, in the day-to-day decisions that we make, and the leadership that we have as to whether or not society gets better. AI is just a tool that's along for the ride. So even in the worst case scenario of those two options, there's still, I think, a really positive potential that can come from it, but it's entirely up to us and what we do with it. I think that's ultimately that kind of paradox of AI that society struggles to wrestle with right now, is that AI is just another tool. And it's the very American analogy that I always give, is that AI is a lot like a gun. That sometimes you want your protector to have a gun because they can help keep you safe, but you never want to have a situation where your attacker has a gun because they can do a lot of damage. And I think AI is the same way. If somebody has AI and they mean well, they can do a lot of really positive work. But if someone has AI and they mean to do harm, they can do a lot of harm, far more than they could without it.
Well, Justin, thank you for these final words for this episode. I think it's really informational full. So we did a good job.
Thank you. Well, hopefully people like it. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, and we dive into the kind of AI that actually matters. And if this one made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Unicorn Buzz, nový podcast Forbes Slovensko o startupoch a inováciách. Viac info si prečítajte aj na forbes.sk.